when General Harrison Kellerman ordered Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves to report to his office at 0600 hours. She knew her carefully maintained cover was about to be tested in ways she never anticipated. What she didn't expect was for him to grab a pair of military-issue scissors and hack off her regulation-length auburn hair as punishment for what he called insubordination and conduct unbecoming. But as those severed locks fell to the polished floor of his office, neither of them realized that this single act of petty cruelty would uncover a secret so explosive it would silence the entire Whitmore Air Force Base within 48 hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air at Whitmore carried the sharp bite of Colorado winter, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. The base sprawled across 30,000 acres of high desert, its runways stretching toward the Front Range mountains that loomed like sleeping giants against the star-punctured sky. F-22 Raptors sat in neat rows on the tarmac, their angular surfaces gleaming under the sodium lights, while transport aircraft and tankers filled the auxiliary fields. This was home to the 347th Tactical Fighter Wing, one of the Air Force's premier combat units, and every person on base knew they were part of something important. Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves walked across the main parade ground with the measured pace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. At 28, she was unremarkable by design. Average height, average build, her auburn hair pulled back in the standard military bun that revealed nothing of the precision with which she arranged it each morning. Her uniform was the standard-issue airman battle uniform in the familiar tiger stripe digital camouflage, clean and pressed, but showing the wear patterns of someone who actually worked for a living rather than merely appearing at ceremonial functions. The only unusual thing about her appearance was the complete absence of unit patches, rank insignia, or name tapes that would normally identify her role on base. Where other airmen displayed their squadron emblems, their career field badges, their accumulated ribbons and decorations, Cassandra's uniform was sterile, anonymous. To the casual observer, she might have been a transient, someone passing through between assignments, or perhaps a civilian contractor who hadn't yet received her proper credentials. This anonymity was carefully cultivated and absolutely essential to her survival. She moved through the base like a ghost, present but unnoticed, familiar but not memorable. The security guards at the main gate knew her face well enough to wave her through without checking her ID, but they couldn't have told you her name or her job if their lives depended on it. The airmen in the dining facility served her meals with professional courtesy but no recognition. The administrative clerks processed her routine paperwork with efficient indifference. She existed in the spaces between attention, in the gaps where military bureaucracy lost track of individual human beings. This morning was different, though. This morning she had been summoned. The summons had come via official channels, a formal written order delivered to her quarters by a stone-faced staff sergeant who refused to meet her eyes. "General Kellerman wants to see you," he had said, his voice carrying the peculiar mixture of respect and unease that people developed when they sensed they were dealing with something outside their understanding. 0600 hours, don't be late. Cassandra had read the order 3 times, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. General Harrison Kellerman was the base commander, a man whose reputation preceded him like the shockwave from a supersonic aircraft. He was known for his iron discipline, his intolerance for anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of military excellence, and his particular disdain for what he called special snowflakes, personnel who operated outside normal command structures or who seemed to believe their roles exempted them from standard military courtesy. The problem was that Cassandra fell squarely into that category, though for reasons that Kellerman couldn't possibly understand. Her official records, the ones that any base commander would have access to, listed her as a communications specialist, grade E3, assigned to the 347th Communications Squadron for routine network maintenance and user support. Her security clearance was listed as secret, standard for someone who might occasionally handle classified equipment, but who wasn't trusted with anything truly sensitive. Her performance evaluations were consistently average, good enough to avoid negative attention, not outstanding enough to warrant special recognition. On paper, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a competent but unremarkable technician doing a necessary but unglamorous job. The reality was far more complex. Buried beneath 7 layers of classification, accessible only to a handful of people, with need-to-know authorization and compartmented clearances that existed in databases so secure they didn't officially exist, was her true identity. She was not Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves, communications specialist. She was Commander Cassandra Reeves, United States Space Force, assigned to the Office of Strategic Intelligence, Electromagnetic Warfare Division, Project Nightfall. Project Nightfall was the Pentagon's most classified response to the changing nature of modern warfare. While traditional military thinking still focused on kinetic operations, bullets, bombs, and boots on the ground, a small cadre of visionaries had recognized that the next war would be fought in the electromagnetic spectrum. Satellites would be hacked, GPS would be spoofed, communications would be jammed, and the side that controlled the invisible battlefield of radio waves and data streams would determine the outcome of conflicts before the first shot was fired. Cassandra was one of only 12 officers worldwide trained in what the classified literature called multi-domain electronic operations. She could hijack enemy satellite networks, turn their own GPS systems against them, and create electromagnetic signatures that would make entire enemy formations invisible to their own command structures. Her training had taken place in facilities so secret they didn't appear on any map under instructors whose names were classified, using equipment that officially didn't exist. She had been inserted into Whitmore Air Force Base 18 months ago as part of a long-term penetration exercise designed to test the security of critical military installations. Her mission was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. Operate undetected within a major air base, maintain her cover identity, and gradually map the base's entire electronic infrastructure in preparation for potential defensive or offensive operations. For 18 months, she had lived a double life. During the day, she fixed computers and installed network cables, playing the role of a competent but unremarkable technician. During the night, she conducted operations that no one on the base could imagine. She had mapped every frequency, cataloged every transmission, and identified vulnerabilities in systems that the base's own security personnel didn't know existed. She could disable the base's entire air traffic control system with a few keystrokes, or turn the perimeter security network against itself, or make the F-22s disappear from radar as if they had never existed, and now General Kellerman wanted to see her. As she approached the headquarters building, Cassandra felt the familiar weight of maintaining her dual existence. She had to be careful not to walk too purposefully, not to show the situational awareness that 18 months of covert operations had ingrained in her. She had to remember to fumble slightly with her ID card at the security checkpoint, to show just enough uncertainty about the building's layout to seem like someone who rarely visited the command section. She had to be Cassandra Reeves, communications specialist, not Commander Reeves, electronic warfare officer. The headquarters building rose before her like a monument to military authority, its facade of gray concrete and mirrored glass reflecting the pre-dawn sky. Inside, she knew General Kellerman was waiting with whatever grievance had prompted this early morning summons. He would see what he expected to see: a junior enlisted airman who had somehow stepped out of line and needed correction. He would never imagine that he was about to confront one of the most dangerous people on his base, someone whose true capabilities could reshape the balance of power in the electromagnetic domain. As Cassandra climbed the steps to the main entrance, she had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, her carefully maintained anonymity would be shattered forever, and that the simple act of a general's petty cruelty would trigger a chain of events that would force her to reveal capabilities that were supposed to remain buried in the deepest levels of military classification. The automatic doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic whisper, and she stepped inside to face whatever General Kellerman had in store for her, carrying her secret like a loaded weapon that no one suspected existed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. General Harrison Kellerman stood behind his mahogany desk like a monument to military authority, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow that seemed to darken the entire corner office. At 53, he was the embodiment of what the Air Force considered leadership material: square jaw, steel gray hair, cut to regulation perfection, and pale blue eyes that had never encountered a problem they couldn't solve through the application of discipline and unwavering adherence to protocol. His office reflected his worldview with museum-like precision. The walls were lined with photographs documenting a career that read like a textbook on military excellence: flight school graduation, squadron command ceremonies, deployment photos from Iraq and Afghanistan, and formal portraits with successive secretaries of defense. His desk displayed a collection of challenge coins, arranged in perfect geometric patterns, each one representing a unit he had commanded or a mission he had completed with distinction. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the flight line, where the morning shift was already beginning their pre-flight preparations. F-22 Raptors sat in their hardened aircraft shelters like sleeping predators, their angular surfaces designed to slip through enemy radar like ghosts. This was Kellerman's domain, a $2.3 billion installation that housed some of the most advanced military technology on Earth, and he ruled it with the absolute authority of a man who had never questioned whether his understanding of the world was complete. To Kellerman, the military was a simple equation: clear hierarchy, defined roles, measurable results. You followed orders, you maintained standards, you respected the chain of command, and the system functioned with the precision of a Swiss chronometer. Personnel who didn't fit this model, the special operators who answered to different commands, the intelligence specialists with their compartmented clearances, the technical experts who seemed to operate by their own rules, represented chaos that needed to be controlled. He had built his reputation on bringing order to disorder, on taking problematic units and individuals and either molding them to fit military standards or removing them from the equation entirely. His methods were old school but effective: direct confrontation, immediate consequences, and the kind of public correction that left no doubt about who was in charge. This morning's target represented everything he found problematic about the modern Air Force. Colonel Rebecca Thorne, his deputy commander for operations, stood at military attention beside the desk, her expression carefully neutral but her posture radiating discomfort. At 45, Thorne was everything Kellerman wasn't: methodical where he was impulsive, diplomatic where he was confrontational, and possessed of the kind of technical understanding that made her invaluable for managing the complex systems that kept a modern airbase operational. "Sir," she began carefully, "I've reviewed the incident reports, and I'm not certain that Lieutenant Reeves's actions constitute—" "Colonel," Kellerman interrupted, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to ending conversations before they began. "I've been running air bases since before that girl was old enough to enlist. I know insubordination when I see it." The incident in question had occurred 3 days earlier during what should have been a routine facility inspection. Kellerman had been conducting his weekly walkthrough of the communications squadron, examining equipment, questioning personnel, and ensuring that his standards were being maintained at every level. It was the kind of hands-on leadership that he believed separated effective commanders from desk-bound administrators. He had encountered Lieutenant Reeves in the main server room, alone, working at a terminal that displayed what appeared to be diagnostic information. When he had approached and demanded to know what she was doing, her response had been textbook military courtesy, respectful, precise, technically accurate. But something about her manner had struck him as wrong. She had answered his questions without hesitation, explaining that she was conducting routine network maintenance, updating security protocols, and verifying system integrity. Her explanations were complete, professional, and delivered with the kind of technical competence that should have impressed him. Instead, they had triggered something deeper, a sense that this junior enlisted airman was somehow talking down to him, treating him like someone who wouldn't understand the complexities of what she was doing. "She looked at me," Kellerman said to Colonel Thorne, "like I was some kind of amateur, like my questions were beneath her notice. That kind of attitude is a cancer, Rebecca. You let one person think they're above military courtesy, and before you know it, the entire chain of command breaks down." Thorne chose her words carefully. She had worked with Kellerman long enough to recognize the warning signs when his sense of military order felt threatened. "Sir, Lieutenant Reeves has no documented disciplinary problems. Her performance evaluations are consistently satisfactory. Her immediate supervisors report no issues with her attitude or military bearing." "Her supervisors," Kellerman said with evident disdain, "are technical specialists who wouldn't recognize military bearing if it saluted them. They are more concerned with keeping their networks running than maintaining proper discipline. That's the problem with these support specialties. They forget they're in the military first and technicians second." The truth was that Kellerman had never fully trusted the technical branches of the Air Force. In his worldview, real airmen flew aircraft or maintained aircraft or supported the people who flew aircraft. Everyone else, the communications specialists, the intelligence analysts, the cyber warfare officers, represented a dilution of the service's core mission. They were necessary, perhaps, but they weren't real warriors, and they certainly shouldn't be allowed to operate with the kind of independence that seemed to breed arrogance and disrespect. "What specific action are you planning to take, sir?" Thorne asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Kellerman opened a desk drawer and removed a pair of military-issue scissors, the kind used in field conditions when precision wasn't as important as function. He placed them on his desk with deliberate ceremony, like a judge laying down a gavel. "Military grooming standards exist for a reason, Colonel. They're not suggestions, they're not guidelines. They're orders that apply to every person wearing this uniform, regardless of their specialty or their personal preferences." Thorne felt a chill of apprehension. "Sir, Lieutenant Reeves's appearance is within regulations. Her hair length meets Air Force standards." "Barely," Kellerman replied, "and given her apparent attitude problem, I think it's time to remove any ambiguity about what military standard means. She wants to act like she's above normal military courtesy? Fine. She can learn what real military discipline looks like." The plan was simple in its cruelty. Kellerman would order Lieutenant Reeves to his office under the pretense of discussing her performance. Once she arrived, he would cite minor grooming infractions, hair slightly too long, presentation not crisp enough for someone representing the Air Force, and personally correct the deficiencies. It was within his authority as base commander, technically justified by regulations that gave commanding officers broad latitude in enforcing standards, and guaranteed to deliver the kind of public humiliation that would serve as an example to anyone else who might be tempted to show insufficient respect. "General," Thorne said, making one final attempt to redirect his course, "perhaps we could schedule Lieutenant Reeves for additional professional military education, or assign her to a different duty section if you feel her current role is inappropriate for her experience level." Kellerman shook his head. "The Air Force has gone soft, Rebecca. We've forgotten that discipline isn't about making people comfortable. It's about creating the kind of order and respect that allows a military organization to function under stress. This girl needs to learn her place in the hierarchy, and everyone who witnesses the lesson needs to understand that no one is above basic military courtesy." At 05:55 hours, Kellerman's aide, Technical Sergeant David Martinez, knocked on the office door. "Sir, Lieutenant Reeves is here as requested." "Send her in," Kellerman said, positioning himself behind his desk in the manner he had perfected over decades of command. Feet planted, shoulders back, expression set in the kind of stern neutrality that made subordinates understand they were being evaluated and found wanting. He had no way of knowing that the young woman about to enter his office carried security clearances that exceeded his own, or that her true mission on his base was so classified that even acknowledging its existence required authorization from the Secretary of Defense. He saw only what his worldview allowed him to see: a junior enlisted airman who had forgotten her place and needed correction. The scissors lay on his desk like an instrument of judgment, their steel surfaces catching the morning light from the windows. In a few moments he would use them to deliver a lesson in military discipline that he believed would restore proper order to his command. What he would actually accomplish was far different and far more dangerous than anything his conventional understanding of military authority could have prepared him for. Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves entered General Kellerman's office at precisely 600 hours, her posture reflecting the kind of military bearing that had been drilled into her through years of training that went far deeper than basic enlisted instruction. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to manage every aspect of her physical presence, from the angle of her shoulders to the rhythm of her breathing. "Lieutenant Reeves reporting as ordered, sir," she announced, coming to attention 3 feet from his desk, with the kind of textbook military courtesy that left no room for criticism. Her voice carried no emotion, not defiance, not fear, not uncertainty. It was the voice of a professional fulfilling a requirement, nothing more. Kellerman studied her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes cataloging every detail of her appearance. Her uniform was pressed to regulation standards, her boots polished to a mirror shine, her hair arranged in the standard military bun with not a strand out of place. By any objective measure, she met Air Force grooming and appearance standards. But to Kellerman's eye, there was something subtly wrong about her presentation, an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical, a precision that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "At ease," he said finally, though his tone suggested that relaxation was not actually an option. "Lieutenant, how long have you been assigned to Whitmore Air Force Base?" 18 months, sir," Cassandra replied without hesitation. The answer was technically accurate, though it omitted the 6 months of preparation and cover development that had preceded her arrival, the careful construction of her false identity, and the ongoing mission that made every day on the base a performance of carefully calibrated deception. 18 months, Kellerman repeated, moving around his desk to stand directly in front of her. "And in that time, how many times have you been to this office?" "This is my first time, sir." Another accurate but incomplete answer. She had been in this office before, twice in fact, but those visits had occurred at 300 hours when the building was empty and the security systems had been temporarily compromised by her own electronic intrusion capabilities. She had spent those midnight hours photographing classified documents, copying hard drives, and installing surveillance devices that the base's own security personnel would never detect. "Your first time," Kellerman mused. "Interesting. Most airmen, even good ones, end up in the commander's office at least once during their tour, usually for recognition, sometimes for correction, but you've managed to remain completely invisible to the command structure. That's either extremely good performance or extremely careful anonymity." Colonel Thorne shifted uncomfortably behind the general, recognizing the trap being constructed but powerless to prevent it. She had reviewed Lieutenant Reeves's personnel file that morning, and everything about the young woman's record suggested exemplary service. Her performance evaluations were consistently above average. Her technical skills were highly rated by her supervisors, and she had never been the subject of any disciplinary action. Whatever grievance Kellerman harbored seemed to be based more on intuition than evidence. "I prefer to focus on my duties, sir," Cassandra said. "I find that maintaining high standards in my work keeps me from requiring command attention." It was precisely the wrong thing to say. Kellerman's expression hardened as he heard the subtle implications in her response. To his ear, she was suggesting that other airmen required command attention because they failed to maintain high standards, while she operated above such mundane concerns. It was the kind of quiet arrogance that he had dedicated his career to eliminating, the attitude that suggested some people considered themselves exempt from normal military discipline. "High standards," he repeated slowly. "That's interesting, Lieutenant, because I've been observing your work lately, and I have some concerns about your interpretation of those standards." He began to pace in front of her, his movement deliberate and predatory. "3 days ago, I conducted an inspection of your work area. Do you remember that inspection?" "Yes, sir." Cassandra's voice remained level, but internally she was analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression. Her training had included extensive instruction in reading human behavior, in detecting threats before they materialized, and in managing confrontations with people who possessed conventional authority but lacked understanding of her true capabilities. Kellerman was following a predictable pattern, building toward some predetermined conclusion through a series of leading questions designed to justify whatever action he had already decided to take. "During that inspection," Kellerman continued, "I asked you several questions about your work. Do you recall your responses?" "I provided technical explanations of the network maintenance procedures I was conducting, sir." "Technical explanations?" Kellerman stopped pacing and faced her directly. "Is that what you call it when you lecture a general officer about computers? When you use technical jargon that you know he won't understand? When you make it clear that you consider his questions beneath your expertise?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a weapons discharge. Colonel Thorne started to speak, but Kellerman silenced her with a gesture. "Sir," Cassandra said carefully, "I apologize if my responses seemed inappropriate. I was attempting to provide accurate information about systems that require precise technical vocabulary to describe properly." "Precise technical vocabulary," Kellerman repeated with evident sarcasm. "Or perhaps you were demonstrating that you consider yourself smarter than the officers in your chain of command. Perhaps you think that because you work with computers, you're somehow exempt from the basic military courtesy that every other airman manages to display." The confrontation was escalating according to a script that Cassandra recognized from her training. Kellerman had decided that she represented a challenge to his authority, and he was now constructing a justification for whatever punishment he intended to deliver. Her optimal response would be to de-escalate, to provide him with the submission and deference he was seeking, to play the role of the chastened subordinate who had learned her lesson. But 18 months of maintaining her cover identity had taken a psychological toll that her training hadn't fully prepared her for. Living a lie required constant vigilance, constant performance, constant suppression of her true capabilities and knowledge. She had spent a year and a half pretending to be less intelligent, less capable, less aware than she actually was. She had endured countless instances of being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated by people whose understanding of modern warfare was decades out of date. And now this general, this man whose greatest technological challenge was probably operating his smartphone, was accusing her of arrogance because she had tried to explain concepts that his mind couldn't grasp. "Sir," she said, and for the first time a slight edge crept into her voice, "I have always conducted myself according to military regulations and professional standards. If my technical competence has been misinterpreted as disrespect, that was not my intention." It was a carefully phrased response that acknowledged his concern while subtly defending her position. But to Kellerman's ear, it sounded like defiance wrapped in military courtesy, the kind of legalistic evasion that clever subordinates used when they thought they could outsmart their superiors. "Technical competence," he said, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that experienced NCOs learn to recognize as the calm before administrative storm. "Let me tell you something about technical competence, Lieutenant. In the Air Force, your technical skills matter exactly as much as your ability to follow orders and show proper respect to senior officers. And right now, I'm seeing a lot of the former and very little of the latter." He moved back to his desk and picked up the scissors, holding them where she could see them clearly. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the soft snick of the blades opening and closing seemed to fill the silence that followed. "Military grooming standards," Kellerman announced, "are not suggestions. They are direct orders that apply to every person wearing this uniform. And I've noticed that your hair, while technically within regulations, represents the absolute maximum length permitted. Combined with your apparent attitude problem, I think it's time for a more definitive interpretation of what military standards actually mean." Colonel Thorne stepped forward. "General, I must protest. Lieutenant Reeves's grooming is within established parameters, and there's no regulation that permits—" "Colonel," Kellerman cut her off, "you're dismissed. This is between Lieutenant Reeves and me. Sir, I respectfully request permission to remain. As Deputy Commander for Operations, I should be present for any disciplinary action involving personnel under my oversight." Kellerman's face darkened. "I said you're dismissed, Colonel. That wasn't a request." Thorne hesitated, clearly struggling between her instinct to protect a subordinate and her obligation to follow orders. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she saluted and left the office, her footsteps echoing in the corridor outside. Now it was just the two of them, a general with scissors, and a lieutenant whose true identity was buried so deeply in classified files that acknowledging it would require authorization from the highest levels of the Defense Department. "Turn around," Kellerman ordered. "Face the window." Cassandra complied, her movements mechanical and precise. Through the glass, she could see the flight line where maintenance crews were preparing the F-22s for their morning sorties. Those aircraft represented the pinnacle of conventional military technology, stealth fighters capable of dominating any traditional battlefield. But they were utterly dependent on the invisible infrastructure that she could manipulate at will, the GPS satellites that guided their navigation, the communication networks that coordinated their missions, the data links that connected them to command and control. She felt Kellerman's presence behind her as he approached with the scissors. In a few moments he would begin cutting her hair as an act of petty dominance, a demonstration of his power over someone he perceived as insubordinate. He would view it as necessary discipline, a correction that would restore proper order to his command. He had no way of knowing that he was about to assault one of the most classified and valuable assets in the entire Department of Defense. He couldn't imagine that the quiet lieutenant standing before him possessed capabilities that could disable every system on his base, that her true mission was so sensitive it was known to fewer than 50 people in the entire government, or that what he was about to do would trigger a chain of events that would expose secrets that were never meant to see daylight. The first snick of the scissors cutting through her hair sounded like thunder in the quiet office, and with it, the careful architecture of 18 months of covert operations began to crumble. The first cut sent auburn strands cascading to the polished linoleum floor like fallen leaves. Each severed lock a small violation that Cassandra absorbed with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything else. The scissors moved through her hair with deliberate roughness. This wasn't a professional haircut designed to maintain military standards, but a crude hacking intended to humiliate and assert dominance. "Hold still," Kellerman commanded unnecessarily. Cassandra hadn't moved a muscle since assuming her position facing the window. Her breathing remained steady at 12 breaths per minute. Her heart rate maintained its disciplined 68 beats per minute, and her hands stayed clasped behind her back in the perfect parade rest position that had been drilled into her through countless hours of military bearing instruction. But beneath the surface calm, something else was happening. Her mind, trained through years of classified programs that didn't officially exist, was conducting the kind of threat assessment that had become as automatic as breathing. Visual scanning of the office revealed 17 potential weapons within reach, from the letter opener on Kellerman's desk to the heavy glass paperweight that could fracture a skull with sufficient force. The door was 12 feet away, requiring 2.3 seconds to reach at combat speed. The windows were reinforced but could be compromised using the emergency fire axe mounted on the corridor wall. None of this information was useful for her current situation, but cataloging it helped maintain the psychological distance she needed to endure what was happening without losing the careful emotional control that her cover identity required. Snick. Another section of hair fell away, this one longer than military regulations would ever require. Kellerman was taking far more than necessary, cutting close enough to her scalp that the result would be visibly punitive rather than corrective. He was making a statement, establishing a precedent, demonstrating that his authority extended to the most personal aspects of her physical appearance. "You know what your problem is, Lieutenant?" Kellerman's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone who believed he was delivering profound wisdom. "You think being smart makes you special. You think because you understand computers, you're somehow different from every other airman on this base." Snick. More hair joined the growing pile at her feet. "But here's what you're going to learn today," he continued, moving around to attack a different section of her hair. "Smart doesn't matter if you can't follow orders. Technical skills don't matter if you don't know your place in the chain of command. And your place, Lieutenant, is at the bottom of that chain, following the orders of people who've earned the right to give them." Cassandra said nothing. Her training had covered scenarios like this: how to endure personal assault while maintaining operational security, how to absorb humiliation without compromising mission integrity, how to preserve psychological stability when subjected to abuse by people who held conventional authority but lacked understanding of classified realities. What her training hadn't adequately prepared her for was the cumulative effect of 18 months of pretending to be someone she wasn't. For a year and a half, she had suppressed every instinct, Every capability, every aspect of her true identity that might compromise her mission. She had endured being dismissed by officers whose understanding of modern warfare was decades obsolete. She had smiled and nodded while her so-called supervisors explained concepts to her that she had helped develop. She had submitted routine reports to people who couldn't comprehend the true scope of the operations she was conducting under their noses. Every day had been an exercise in calculated diminishment, a deliberate performance of incompetence designed to hide capabilities that could reshape the balance of global power. She had become an expert at appearing average, at seeming satisfied with routine tasks that utilized perhaps 1% of her actual abilities. And now this general, this man whose greatest strategic accomplishment was managing an air base in peacetime, was cutting her hair like she was a recruit who had forgotten to shave, lecturing her about military discipline while demonstrating his complete ignorance of what military effectiveness actually required in the 21st century. Nothing to say, Kellerman observed, pausing in his work to examine his handiwork. That's probably wise. I've found that people usually make things worse for themselves when they try to justify insubordination. He resumed cutting, and Cassandra found herself focusing on the reflection in the window glass. The woman staring back at her looked increasingly unfamiliar. Hair shorn in uneven patches, the careful styling that had been part of her cover identity replaced by something that resembled the aftermath of a field punishment. Soon she would have to leave this office and return to her duties, her altered appearance a visible advertisement of her supposed disgrace. The communications squadron would see her and understand that she had somehow displeased the base commander. Her fellow enlisted personnel would avoid her, not wanting to be associated with someone who had attracted negative command attention. The officers who supervised her routine duties would treat her with additional suspicion, wondering what infractions had led to such visible correction. All of this was manageable within the parameters of her mission. Her operational security protocols had contingency plans for exactly this kind of situation. How to maintain her cover identity even when subjected to disciplinary action, how to continue her intelligence gathering while under increased scrutiny, how to preserve mission integrity despite personal humiliation. But as more hair fell to the floor and Kellerman continued his lecture about respect and military bearing, Cassandra felt something shifting deep in her psychological architecture. The careful walls she had built around her true identity, walls designed to contain 18 months of suppressed capability and knowledge, were beginning to develop hairline fractures. "Almost finished," Kellerman announced with evident satisfaction. "Just need to clean up these straggly bits here, and then we'll see how you look when you're not hiding behind regulations that were written to accommodate people who think they're above military standards." The scissors moved again, and this time they bit deeper than intended. The blade, slightly dull from cutting through thick hair, caught and pulled rather than cutting cleanly. Cassandra felt a sharp tug against her scalp, followed by the warm sensation of blood where the metal had scraped skin. For the first time since entering the office, she moved. Not a flinch or a wince, but a slight adjustment of her head position that removed her scalp from contact with the scissors. It was an automatic defensive response, the kind of reaction that years of combat training had made instinctive. "I said hold still," Kellerman snapped, interpreting her movement as defiance rather than self-preservation. "We're not done here." He reached out with his free hand to grab her shoulder, intending to force her back into position. His grip was firm but not particularly forceful, the casual assertion of physical dominance that men like him had been using to control subordinates for decades. What he didn't expect was the way her body responded to unwanted physical contact. Cassandra didn't consciously decide to react. The response was built into her neural pathways through hundreds of hours of close-quarters combat training, muscle memory that operated faster than conscious thought. When Kellerman's hand closed on her shoulder, her body interpreted it as a hostile grab from behind. Exactly the kind of attack scenario that had been drilled into her through countless repetitions in classified training facilities. Her reaction was subtle but devastating. A slight rotation of her shoulder that broke his grip, combined with a backward step that created distance while simultaneously placing her weight on his instep. To a casual observer, it might have looked like she had simply turned around to face him. To someone trained in combatives, it was a textbook demonstration of how to neutralize a grab while positioning for a counterattack. Kellerman stumbled backward, surprised by the sudden reversal of position and the unexpected loss of control. The scissors fell from his hand, clattering against the desk before tumbling to the floor beside the pile of severed hair. For a moment they faced each other across 3 feet of suddenly electric space. Kellerman's expression showed confusion transitioning to anger as he processed what had just happened. Cassandra's face remained neutral, but something had changed in her posture, a subtle shift that suggested coiled potential rather than passive submission. "Did you just—" Kellerman began, his voice tight with disbelief. "I apologize, sir," Cassandra said, her tone perfectly level. "I lost my balance when you grabbed me." It was technically true, but completely misleading. She hadn't lost her balance. She had demonstrated a level of physical training that no communications specialist should possess, reacting to his contact with the kind of precision that suggested extensive combat instruction. But Kellerman, like most conventional officers, had never been taught to recognize such subtleties. He saw only that his authority had been challenged, that his attempt to assert physical control had been thwarted by someone who was supposed to be helpless under his command. "Lost your balance," he repeated slowly. "Right. Well, Lieutenant, it seems like you need to learn more than just proper grooming standards. It seems like you need a comprehensive lesson in what happens when someone decides to resist lawful correction from a superior officer." He moved toward his desk, reaching for the phone that would connect him directly to the military police. One call would bring armed security personnel to his office, would begin the process that would result in formal charges, a court-martial, and the end of whatever career this insubordinate communications specialist thought she was building. As his hand closed around the receiver, neither of them realized that the real crisis was only beginning and that his next action would trigger the exposure of secrets that were never meant to see daylight at Whitmore Air Force Base. General Kellerman's hand froze on the phone receiver as a soft chime echoed through his office, the distinctive tone that indicated an incoming priority communication through the base's secure command network. The sound was so rare that many officers went their entire careers without hearing it in a non-exercise context. It meant that someone with significant authority needed immediate access to the base commander, and that whatever they wanted to discuss was classified at levels that required special handling. Kellerman glanced at the encrypted terminal on his desk, where a red indicator light pulsed with mechanical urgency. The display showed only a classification level, top secret SCI Nightfall, and a request for immediate secure voice communication from someone identified only as Oversight 7. He had never heard of Nightfall as a classification compartment, and Oversight 7 wasn't a call sign that appeared in any directory he had access to. But the authentication codes were valid, the encryption was genuine, and the priority flags indicated that this communication took precedence over any other activity currently taking place on the base. "Lieutenant," he said without taking his eyes off the terminal, "you're dismissed. Return to your duties. We'll finish this conversation later." Cassandra remained at attention, her ruined hair framing a face that showed no emotion despite the blood still seeping from the shallow cut on her scalp. "Sir, should I report to the first sergeant for further corrective action?" "I said you're dismissed," Kellerman repeated, already reaching for the secure handset. "Get out of my office now." She saluted with mechanical precision and left without another word, her footsteps fading down the corridor as the door sealed behind her with the soft, pneumatic hiss of the building's positive pressure system. Kellerman waited until he was certain she was gone, then activated the secure communication system. "This is General Harrison Kellerman, Commanding Officer, Whitmore Air Force Base. I'm responding to priority communication from Oversight 7. The voice that answered was female, crisp, and carried the kind of authority that came from dealing with matters so classified that most people weren't even allowed to know they existed. "General Kellerman, this is Director Sarah Blackwood, Office of Strategic Intelligence, Electromagnetic Warfare Division. We have a problem." Kellerman had never heard of the Electromagnetic Warfare Division, but the fact that it existed under the Office of Strategic Intelligence suggested capabilities and clearances that operated far above his level. "What kind of problem, ma'am?" "The kind that involves one of my officers, currently operating under deep cover at your installation. An officer whose identity was compromised approximately 4 minutes ago when your base security system detected an anomalous biometric signature in your office." The blood drained from Kellerman's face. Modern military facilities were equipped with sensors, sophisticated enough to detect stress indicators, unusual behavior patterns, and physical trauma. If someone in his office had been injured badly enough to trigger medical monitoring systems, there would be an automatic record of the incident, along with biometric data that could be analyzed to determine exactly what had occurred. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you're referring to. I was conducting routine disciplinary counseling with one of my personnel, a Lieutenant Reeves from the Communications Squadron." "General," Director Blackwood's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "There is no Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves assigned to your base. That identity is a cover for Commander Cassandra Reeves, United States Space Force, one of 12 officers worldwide qualified in multi-domain electronic operations. She's been conducting a classified penetration exercise at your facility for the past 18 months. The words hit Kellerman like physical blows. He sank into his chair, staring at the pile of auburn hair on his office floor with dawning horror. That's not possible. I have her personnel file. Her security clearance is secret level. Her job description is routine network maintenance. Her cover documentation is designed to be convincing, General. It has to be, because her real mission involves capabilities that could disable every electronic system at your installation. The hair you just cut belongs to someone whose security clearance exceeds your own, whose mission is known to fewer than 50 people in the entire government, and whose operational security you have just catastrophically compromised." Kellerman's mind raced through the implications. If what this woman was saying was true, then he had just physically assaulted a senior officer conducting classified operations. He had humiliated someone whose real rank was equivalent to his own, whose true mission was so sensitive that even acknowledging it required authorization from the highest levels of the Defense Department. What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right now, damage control. Commander Reeves's cover identity has been maintained for 18 months through careful psychological conditioning and operational security protocols. Physical assault by her supposed commanding officer wasn't part of the scenario, and we don't know how it will affect her ability to maintain mission parameters." Director Blackwood paused, and when she continued, her tone carried unmistakable menace. More immediately, we need to understand why a general officer decided to physically assault someone under his command. The biometric data shows clear evidence of haircutting, physical restraint, and tissue trauma. Those are criminal acts, General, regardless of the victim's classification status. Kellerman found himself staring at the scissors on his floor, seeing them now not as instruments of military discipline, but as evidence of assault against someone whose true capabilities he couldn't begin to comprehend. She was insubordinate. Her attitude suggested disrespect for military authority. I was correcting deficiencies in military bearing. By cutting her hair? By grabbing her when she tried to avoid injury? General, are you familiar with the term conduct unbecoming an officer? The question hung in the air like the smell of cordite after a weapons discharge. Kellerman realized that his career, 30 years of dedicated service, his reputation, his retirement benefits, everything he had built was balanced on the edge of a precipice that had opened beneath him without warning. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I was not informed that Commander Reeves was conducting classified operations. If I had known her true status, I would never have taken corrective action. The fact that you weren't informed is precisely the point of a covert operation, General. And the fact that you decided to physically assault someone based on your personal interpretation of their attitude suggests a fundamental failure of judgment that we need to address immediately." Director Blackwood's voice shifted, becoming more businesslike. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to remain in your office until a team from my division arrives to conduct damage assessment. You will not discuss this conversation with anyone. You will not attempt to contact Commander Reeves. You will not take any actions related to this matter until we determine the extent of operational compromise." "How long will that take?" Kellerman asked. "As long as necessary. General, do you understand that Commander Reeves has spent 18 months mapping every electronic vulnerability at your installation? She knows the frequency assignments for your communications networks, the encryption keys for your classified systems, and the operational parameters for every piece of equipment that makes your base functional. If her psychological conditioning breaks down because of what you did to her, she could disable this entire facility with a few keystrokes." The implications crashed over Kellerman like an avalanche. He had assumed that cutting some junior enlisted airman's hair was a routine exercise of command authority. Instead, he had potentially triggered a security crisis that could compromise one of the Air Force's most important installations. "What should I tell my staff if they ask why she looks different?" he asked. "You should probably hope that nobody asks, General, because if word spreads that the base commander physically assaulted someone, and if that someone turns out to be conducting classified operations that are vital to national security, you're going to discover that there are consequences in the military justice system that go far beyond anything you've previously imagined." The communication ended with the soft click of a terminated connection, leaving Kellerman alone in his office with the growing pile of hair and the dawning realization that what he had intended as a simple lesson in military discipline had instead opened a door to classified worlds he didn't know existed. Outside his window, the F-22 Raptors continued their routine preparations for morning flights, their crews unaware that their commanding officer had just committed an act that could ultimately compromise every system they depended on. The base continued its daily operations, 60,000 people going about their duties in blissful ignorance of the crisis that was beginning to unfold in the command section. And somewhere in the communication squadron, Commander Cassandra Reeves was returning to her assigned duties with her hair brutally shorn and her cover identity damaged in ways that 18 months of careful preparation had never anticipated. The secure phone on Kellerman's desk remained silent, but he found himself staring at it with the desperate hope that it would ring again and someone would tell him that this had all been a mistake, a misunderstanding that could be corrected with proper paperwork and formal apologies. Deep down, though, he knew that some mistakes were too fundamental to fix, and that what he had done in the name of military discipline was about to reshape not just his own career, but the security of everything he had been trusted to protect. Commander Cassandra Reeves walked through the corridors of Whitmore Air Force Base with the same measured pace she had maintained for 18 months. But everything had changed. The carefully constructed anonymity that had been her greatest asset was now compromised in ways that threatened not just her mission, but the delicate psychological balance that allowed her to function in deep cover operations. Her reflection in the glass doors and polished surfaces she passed revealed the extent of Kellerman's crude barbering. What had once been regulation-length auburn hair arranged in a professional military style was now a chaotic collection of uneven patches, some areas cut nearly to the scalp, while others retained enough length to emphasize the random cruelty of the attack. The shallow cut on her scalp had stopped bleeding, but the dried blood remained visible against her pale skin like evidence of a crime scene. Every person she encountered reacted to her altered appearance with the kind of carefully controlled non-reaction that military personnel learned when they witnessed something they weren't supposed to acknowledge. Technical Sergeant Williams, the communications squadron's senior enlisted leader, glanced at her and immediately looked away, his face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide his shock. Airman First Class Chen, one of her supposed teammates, actually stopped mid-sentence in his conversation with another technician when she passed, his eyes widening before he caught himself and resumed talking in lower tones. The base's social ecosystem, carefully structured around rank and reputation, was already beginning to process the implications of her appearance. Someone who looked like she had been subjected to punitive correction was someone to avoid, someone whose association could bring unwanted attention from the command structure. The invisible networks of friendship and professional cooperation that made military life bearable were shutting down around her with the mechanical precision of blast doors sealing during an emergency. But beneath her outward composure, something far more dangerous was happening. For 18 months, maintaining her cover identity had required constant psychological compartmentalization. She had built mental walls between Commander Cassandra Reeves, the classified electronic warfare specialist, and Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves, the unremarkable communications technician. Those walls had allowed her to endure daily humiliations, to accept orders from people whose understanding of modern warfare was decades obsolete, to smile and nod while her so-called supervisors explained concepts to her that she had helped develop in classified laboratories. The assault in Kellerman's office had shattered those walls. As she made her way to the communications squadron's main work area, her mind was no longer operating according to the careful protocols that had preserved her cover. Instead, she found herself analyzing her environment through the lens of her true capabilities, seeing vulnerabilities and opportunities that the carefully maintained Lieutenant Reeves' persona was never supposed to notice. The base's communication infrastructure was visible to her now, in ways it hadn't been since her first weeks of infiltration. She could see the fiber optic cables running through the ceiling tiles, each one carrying data streams that she could intercept, modify, or destroy at will. The radio antennas on the building roofs were no longer anonymous pieces of equipment, but precisely mapped nodes in a network that she had spent months learning to manipulate. The GPS receivers that guided everything from aircraft navigation to personnel tracking were vulnerable to spoofing techniques that she had perfected in facilities so classified they didn't appear on any organizational chart. For the first time in 18 months, she was seeing Whitmore Air Force Base not as a place where she had to maintain a careful performance of incompetence, but as a target-rich environment where her true capabilities could be deployed with devastating effect. The realization terrified her. She reached her assigned workstation in the communications squadron's main bay, a cramped space filled with computer terminals, diagnostic equipment, and the constant hum of cooling fans that kept sensitive electronics operating within acceptable temperature ranges. Normally, she would log into the network using her limited access credentials and begin the routine maintenance tasks that formed her cover duties. Today, her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she realized that she was no longer thinking like someone whose job was to fix computers. She was thinking like someone whose job was to break them. "Jesus, Reeves, what the hell happened to you?" The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the work center supervisor who had managed her routine duties for the past year. He was approaching her workstation with the kind of expression people wore when they witnessed car accidents. Horrified fascination mixed with the relief that came from not being the victim. "Corrective action, Sergeant," she replied, using the euphemistic language that military personnel employed when they didn't want to discuss unpleasant realities. "General Kellerman felt my grooming standards needed adjustment." Torres studied her ruined hair with the clinical detachment of someone trying to understand the scope of what he was seeing. "Corrective action doesn't usually involve—" He gestured vaguely at her head, apparently unable to find words for what Kellerman had done. "The general was very thorough in his feedback," Cassandra said, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest that further questions would not be welcome. Torres nodded slowly, recognizing the warning signs. In his 12 years of military service, he had learned to identify personnel who were operating close to their psychological limits, and whatever had happened to Reeves in the commander's office had clearly pushed her into dangerous territory. "Look," he said quietly, "why don't you take the rest of the day off? Get some medical attention for that cut. Maybe visit the base barber shop and see if they can even things out a little." It was a kind offer, the sort of human consideration that occasionally penetrated the rigid hierarchy of military organizations. Under normal circumstances, it would have been exactly what she needed: time to process what had happened, to rebuild her psychological defenses, to restore the careful emotional control that her mission required. But these weren't normal circumstances, and she was no longer operating according to the parameters that had guided her for the past 18 months. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, "but I think I'd prefer to focus on my work. It helps me maintain perspective." Torres frowned, recognizing something wrong in her tone, but unable to identify exactly what it was. "Reeves, you don't look like someone who should be working right now. You look like someone who needs to process whatever just happened to you." She turned to face him fully, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger or pain or any of the emotions he might have expected from someone who had been subjected to humiliation and assault. It was something far more unsettling, a kind of cold analytical focus that seemed to be evaluating him as a component in some larger system, rather than as a human being worthy of basic consideration. "I appreciate your concern," she said, "but I'm exactly where I need to be." She logged into her terminal with the smooth efficiency that had characterized all her work at Whitmore, but Torres noticed that her fingers moved across the keyboard with unusual speed and precision. The diagnostic programs she accessed weren't the routine maintenance utilities that comprised her normal duties, but deeper system analysis tools that required authorization levels he wasn't sure she possessed. As he watched, streams of data began flowing across her screen: network topology maps, traffic analysis reports, security protocol assessments. It was the kind of information that only senior system administrators typically accessed, and she was navigating through it with the fluency of someone who had been working with these systems for years rather than months. "Reeves," he said carefully, "what exactly are you doing?" She didn't look away from her screen as she replied, "System optimization, Sergeant. I'm identifying inefficiencies in our network architecture that could be corrected to improve overall performance." It was a technically accurate description that completely obscured what she was actually accomplishing. In reality, she was conducting a comprehensive vulnerability assessment of Whitmore's entire communications infrastructure, mapping attack vectors and identifying critical failure points that could be exploited to disable the base's electronic capabilities. For 18 months, she had gathered this information gradually, carefully, ensuring that her intelligence collection activities remained undetectable. Now, with her psychological conditioning damaged and her cover identity compromised, she was abandoning all pretense of subtlety and conducting the kind of rapid, comprehensive analysis that would have been impossible to hide under normal circumstances. But she was no longer concerned with hiding. The assault in Kellerman's office had broken more than just her hair. It had shattered the careful psychological architecture that allowed her to function as Lieutenant Reeves, the harmless communications technician. What remained was Commander Reeves, the electronic warfare specialist, someone whose capabilities were so dangerous that even acknowledging their existence required authorization from the Secretary of Defense, and Commander Reeves was done pretending to be powerless. The crisis began at 13:47 hours when every electronic system at Whitmore Air Force Base simultaneously experienced what the technical logs would later describe as cascading network failure of unknown origin. It started subtly, GPS receivers showing minute drift errors, communication channels developing barely perceptible static, data transfer rates declining by fractions of a percent. The kind of degradation that automated systems were designed to compensate for, the electronic equivalent of background noise that sophisticated networks routinely filtered out. But within minutes, the subtle became catastrophic. Air traffic control was the first critical system to fail. The massive radar arrays that tracked aircraft within a 100-mile radius of the base simply stopped painting targets. The screens that had displayed the orderly progression of incoming and outgoing flights went blank, leaving controllers staring at empty displays while 23 aircraft remained airborne in increasingly dangerous confusion. "Tower, this is Raptor Lead," the radio crackled with the voice of Major Jennifer Walsh, flight commander of 4 F-22 stealth fighters, conducting routine training exercises 60 miles northeast of the base. "Our navigation systems are showing impossible readings. GPS indicates we're currently over the Pacific Ocean. Request immediate ground-controlled approach vector." The air traffic controller, Senior Airman David Kim, stared at his blank radar screen with growing panic. "Raptor Lead, we are experiencing technical difficulties with our ground-based radar. Stand by for alternative routing." But there was no alternative routing. The backup systems that should have activated automatically were also failing, their displays flickering between error messages and complete blackness. The emergency frequencies that connected the base to regional air traffic control were producing nothing but static. Even the weather monitoring systems had gone dark, leaving the tower crew unable to provide basic atmospheric conditions to aircraft that were now flying blind. "Tower, Raptor Lead, we have 15 minutes of fuel remaining. Whatever technical difficulties you're experiencing, we need immediate assistance or we're going to start looking for highway strips to land on." Kim's hand shook as he reached for the landline phone that connected the tower to the base command center. Dead. The entire telecommunications grid that linked Whitmore to the outside world had simply vanished. as if someone had reached into the electromagnetic spectrum and switched off everything that made modern military operations possible. In the Aerospace Control Center, a hardened bunker designed to survive nuclear attack, Colonel Rebecca Thorne was witnessing the systematic collapse of everything she had spent her career learning to manage. The massive wall displays that normally showed the comprehensive air picture for the entire western United States were dark. The satellite communication links that connected her facility to NORAD, the Pentagon, and Strategic Command had gone silent. Even the internal communication systems that allowed her to coordinate with different sections of her own building were failing in sequence. "Colonel," called out Major Lisa Rodriguez from the operations console, her voice tight with controlled panic. "We've lost contact with all subordinate units. Missile warning systems are offline. Space surveillance is gone. Even the coffee maker in the break room has stopped working." That last detail, absurd as it sounded, actually provided a crucial clue about what was happening. The coffee maker operated on a completely different electrical system than the classified military networks, connected to the base's commercial power grid, rather than the secured infrastructure that supported critical operations. If it was failing along with everything else, then whatever was attacking Whitmore's systems was operating at a level far below normal network security protocols. "Get me a hard line to General Kellerman," Thorne ordered. "Use the emergency landline that runs through the mechanical telephone exchange." Rodriguez tried the connection, listened for a moment, then shook her head. "Nothing, ma'am. Even the old analog systems are dead." Thorne felt a chill of recognition. She had studied electronic warfare scenarios throughout her career, had participated in exercises where opposing forces attempted to degrade communications and navigation systems. But those scenarios always assumed that basic infrastructure would remain functional, that the attack would target military-specific frequencies and protocols while leaving civilian systems intact. What was happening at Whitmore was far more comprehensive. Someone wasn't just jamming their communications or spoofing their GPS signals. Someone was systematically dismantling the electromagnetic environment itself, reaching into the fundamental infrastructure that supported all modern technology and methodically destroying it from the inside out. "Ma'am," said Captain Torres from the intelligence section, his face illuminated by the glow of one of the few terminals still functioning. "I'm reading something that doesn't make sense. The attack signatures are coming from inside the base. Whatever's doing this to us isn't external. It's being generated from somewhere within our own perimeter." In the communications squadron, Staff Sergeant Torres was watching Lieutenant Reeves with growing alarm. For the past hour, she had been working at her terminal with an intensity that bordered on obsession, her fingers moving across multiple keyboards with the kind of fluid precision that suggested capabilities far beyond routine network maintenance. The screens around her displayed information flows that he had never seen before, complex data streams that seemed to map the entire base's electronic infrastructure in real time. "Reeves," he said for the third time, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose patience was exhausted. "I need you to stop what you're doing and explain to me exactly what kind of system optimization you're performing." She looked up from her screens, and Torres saw something in her expression that made him step backward involuntarily. Her face showed no stress, no concern about the obvious system failures that were affecting every piece of equipment in the building. Instead, she displayed the kind of calm focus that he associated with surgeons performing delicate operations or pilots executing complex maneuvers under combat conditions. "I'm correcting inefficiencies," she said, her voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. "For 18 months, I've been documenting systemic weaknesses in this installation's electronic architecture, Today seemed like an appropriate time to address those weaknesses. Address them how? Torres demanded. Half the base has lost communications, and you're sitting here talking about system optimization, like it's a routine maintenance procedure. Cassandra's fingers never stopped moving as she replied, Sergeant, do you know what the most significant vulnerability is in any complex network? It's not the hardware, it's not the software, it's the assumption that the people operating the system understand what the system actually does. She gestured to the screens around her, which displayed network diagnostic information that seemed to update in real time as various systems throughout the base continued to fail. For example, did you know that the GPS receivers used by our aircraft navigation systems are vulnerable to a specific type of signal injection that can be generated using nothing more than a properly configured software-defined radio? Or that the encryption keys protecting our classified communications are rotated according to a predictable algorithm that can be reverse-engineered if you have access to traffic analysis over an extended period? Torres felt ice forming in his stomach as he began to understand what he was witnessing. Reeves, are you telling me that you're responsible for the system failures we're experiencing? I'm telling you that I've spent 18 months learning exactly how this base functions, she replied. And today I decided to demonstrate that knowledge in a practical way. Before Torres could respond, the lights in the communications bay flickered and went out. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in the red glow of backup lighting, but the impression of fundamental system failure was unmistakable. Throughout Whitmore Air Force Base, 60,000 personnel were discovering that the technology they depended on for everything from navigation to communication to basic electrical power was no longer trustworthy. Aircraft remained stranded in the air with nowhere to land safely. Ground crews found themselves unable to communicate with the pilots they were supposed to support. Security forces couldn't coordinate their activities or access the electronic locks that secured sensitive facilities. And in a small workbay in the communications squadron, Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves continued typing with mechanical precision, methodically dismantling the electronic infrastructure of one of America's most important military installations while her supervisor watched in growing horror. The crisis that General Kellerman had triggered with a pair of scissors was rapidly escalating beyond anyone's ability to control, and the woman whose hair he had cut was proving to have capabilities that threatened everything he had been trusted to protect. The transformation began at 14:23 hours when Staff Sergeant Torres made the decision that would change everything. Watching Lieutenant Reeves systematically dismantle Whitmore's electronic infrastructure while maintaining the demeanor of someone performing routine maintenance had finally convinced him that he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding or authority to handle. "I'm calling this in," he announced, reaching for the secure phone that connected the communications squadron directly to the base command center. The line was dead as he had expected, but military training had prepared him for communication failures. He activated his personal radio and switched to the emergency frequency that all senior NCOs were required to monitor. "Command post, this is communications control. I have a priority alpha situation in building 447. Request immediate security response and senior officer involvement." The response came back through heavy static, barely intelligible. "Communications control, command post, all security. Currently responding to infrastructure failures. Cannot personnel at this time." Torres looked at Reeves, who continued typing with mechanical precision while the base collapsed around them. Her screens now displayed real-time status updates from systems throughout Whitmore, showing the systematic failure of everything from air traffic control to perimeter security. It was like watching someone conduct an orchestra, except the music was the death song of modern military technology. "Reeves," he said, abandoning all pretense of normal military courtesy. "I don't know who you really are or what you're actually doing, but I need you to stop, now. People are going to die if this continues." For the first time since the crisis began, Cassandra's fingers paused over the keyboard. She turned to look at Torres, and he saw something flicker across her expression, not quite emotion, but perhaps recognition that her actions had consequences beyond the abstract satisfaction of demonstrating technical superiority. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, "do you remember what you told me when I first arrived at this assignment? You said that the most important thing about working in communications is understanding that everything depends on us. Every aircraft, every mission, every life on this base depends on the systems we maintain." "Yes," Torres replied carefully, sensing that he was navigating through psychological territory that could explode without warning. "That's why I need you to stop whatever you're doing and help me restore these systems." Cassandra's laugh was soft and bitter. "Restore them? I've spent 18 months documenting how fundamentally broken they were to begin with. Did you know that our primary communications encryption is using algorithms that were compromised by foreign intelligence services 6 years ago? Or that the navigation systems our pilots depend on can be spoofed by equipment that costs less than a new car?" She gestured to her screens, which displayed vulnerability assessments that Torres was beginning to realize represented months or years of analysis. "Every system on this base is held together by wishful thinking and institutional momentum. What I'm doing isn't breaking anything. I'm demonstrating how broken everything already was." Before Torres could respond, the emergency lighting failed. Complete darkness engulfed the communications bay for 30 seconds before battery-powered emergency illumination activated, casting everything in a pale green glow that made everyone look like corpses. "Jesus Christ," whispered Airman Chen from across the room. "She's killing the entire base." But Cassandra shook her head. "I'm not killing anything. I'm revealing the truth. For 18 months, I've watched officers and NCOs make decisions based on their assumption that our systems were secure, reliable, and effective. I've seen mission planning that depended on capabilities that don't actually exist. I've witnessed confidence that was completely unjustified by the reality of our technical infrastructure." Her voice carried an edge that Torres had never heard before. Not anger exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous. "Today, General Kellerman decided to teach me a lesson about military discipline. He wanted to demonstrate his authority by physically assaulting me. Well, now I'm teaching everyone a lesson about what real authority looks like." She turned back to her terminal and resumed typing. "Real authority isn't about rank or position or the ability to humiliate subordinates. Real authority comes from understanding how things actually work and having the capability to make them work differently." Torres watched in fascination and horror as new data streams appeared on her screens. She was now displaying information that he recognized as classified beyond his clearance level. Satellite communication protocols, missile guidance systems, nuclear command and control networks. Somehow, this lieutenant who had spent 18 months fixing routine computer problems had access to some of the most sensitive military systems in existence. "Reeves," he said slowly, "what's your real security clearance?" She didn't look up from her work. "Higher than yours, Staff Sergeant. Higher than Colonel Thorne's. Higher than General Kellerman's." The implications hit Torres like a physical blow. If what she was saying was true, then everything he thought he knew about her was wrong. She wasn't a junior enlisted communications specialist. She was something else entirely, someone operating at levels of classification and authority that most military personnel never even knew existed. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm the person who's been keeping this base functional for the past year and a half," she replied. "I'm the person who identified and quietly corrected 47 critical vulnerabilities in your networks before they could be exploited by actual enemies. I'm the person who prevented 3 separate attempts by foreign intelligence services to penetrate your classified systems." Her fingers moved with increasing speed as she spoke, and Torres could see additional systems failing throughout the base. But now he was beginning to understand that the failures weren't random or malicious. They were surgical, precise, designed to demonstrate specific vulnerabilities without causing permanent damage. Every GPS error, every communication failure, every power disruption you're witnessing can be reversed instantly, Cassandra continued. But first, everyone on this base needs to understand exactly how dependent they are on systems they don't comprehend, managed by people they don't respect, protected by security measures they don't believe they need. She pulled up a new screen that displayed the real-time positions of the F-22 fighters still circling overhead, burning fuel while their pilots struggled with navigation systems that showed impossible readings. Those pilots have 13 minutes of fuel remaining before they need to attempt emergency landings on highways. The air traffic controllers who are supposed to guide them to safety are staring at blank radar screens. The communication systems that should connect them to alternate airfields are producing nothing but static. Torres felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was watching someone with the capability to save or doom every person on the base, and everything depended on his ability to understand what was happening and respond appropriately. "What do you want?" he asked. Cassandra paused in her typing and looked at him with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "I want everyone to understand what I've understood for 18 months. I want them to realize that their confidence in their own capabilities is completely unjustified. I want them to acknowledge that the person they've been dismissing as an irrelevant technician is actually the only thing standing between them and catastrophic system failure." She turned back to her terminal, where new alerts were appearing with mechanical regularity. "And I want General Kellerman to understand that cutting someone's hair doesn't make them less dangerous. It just makes them less interested in pretending to be harmless." As if summoned by her words, the emergency communication system crackled to life with a transmission that would change everything. All personnel, this is Emergency Command Authority. Code Red is now in effect. All aircraft are ordered to land immediately at alternate airfields. All base personnel will remain in current positions until further notice. This is not a drill." The crisis had officially escalated beyond anyone's ability to contain, and the woman whose hair had been cut as punishment was about to demonstrate capabilities that would silence the entire base in ways that no one could have imagined. The moment of absolute reversal came at 14:56 hours when General Harrison Kellerman received a communication that shattered his understanding of military authority, command structure, and his own place in the hierarchy he had spent 30 years climbing. He sat alone in his office, surrounded by the evidence of what he now understood had been a catastrophic error in judgment. The pile of auburn hair on his floor seemed to mock him with every glance, each severed strand a reminder of the assault he had committed against someone whose true identity he was only beginning to comprehend. The secure communication system that had delivered Director Blackwood's initial warning had remained ominously silent for over an hour, leaving him to contemplate the scope of his mistake while his base collapsed around him. The base-wide communication failure had isolated him as effectively as if he had been placed in solitary confinement. His normal command and control systems were dead. His staff was unable to reach him through conventional channels, and the steady stream of situation reports that usually kept him informed of every significant event on his installation had simply vanished. He was commanding officer of one of the Air Force's most important facilities, and he had no idea what was happening beyond his office walls. When the secure terminal finally activated with an incoming priority communication, Kellerman approached it with the trepidation of someone opening a letter that he knew contained a cancer diagnosis. General Kellerman, the voice was new, male, carrying the kind of authority that suggested very senior rank and even more senior clearances. This is Deputy Director James Morrison, Defense Intelligence Agency, Special Access Programs. I'm calling to inform you that Operation Nightfall has just transitioned from passive intelligence gathering to active demonstration mode. Kellerman felt his stomach drop. Sir, I'm not familiar with Operation Nightfall. No, you wouldn't be. It's compartmented above your clearance level. But since your actions have directly compromised the operation, you're about to receive a very comprehensive briefing on what you've been hosting at your installation for the past 18 months. The next 30 minutes destroyed everything Kellerman thought he knew about his own base, his own mission, and his own competence as a military commander. Operation Nightfall, Morrison explained, was the Defense Department's most classified response to the reality of modern warfare. While conventional military thinking still focused on kinetic operations, aircraft, missiles, tanks, and troops, a small group of visionaries had recognized that future conflicts would be won or lost in the electromagnetic spectrum, the side that controlled satellites, GPS signals, communication networks, and data streams would determine the outcome of wars before the first conventional shot was fired. Commander Cassandra Reeves, Morrison continued, is one of 12 officers worldwide trained in multi-domain electronic operations. Her capabilities include satellite network penetration, GPS spoofing, communication encryption breaking, and electromagnetic signature manipulation. She can disable entire theater-level command and control networks, turn enemy navigation systems against themselves, and make military formations disappear from their own radar coverage. Kellerman listened with growing horror as Morrison described the 18-month penetration exercise that Reeves had been conducting at Whitmore. She had mapped every vulnerability, cataloged every weakness, and identified attack vectors that the base's own security personnel didn't know existed. Her mission was to demonstrate whether a properly trained electronic warfare specialist could operate undetected within a major military installation, gathering intelligence and positioning herself to disable critical systems if necessary. The answer to that question, Morrison said, with evident satisfaction, appears to be yes. Commander Reeves has just demonstrated that she can bring your entire base to its knees, using nothing more than a standard computer terminal and 18 months of preparation. How is that possible? Kellerman asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because, General, you've been operating under the assumption that your systems are secure when they're actually held together with digital duct tape and wishful thinking. Commander Reeves identified 47 critical vulnerabilities in your networks during her first month at Whitmore. She spent the subsequent 17 months developing exploitation techniques that your security personnel couldn't detect if their lives depended on it. Morrison paused, and when he continued, his tone carried unmistakable menace. What makes this particularly interesting from our perspective is that Commander Reeves wasn't supposed to reveal her capabilities under any circumstances. Her psychological conditioning was specifically designed to allow her to maintain her cover identity regardless of stress or provocation. The fact that she's now actively demonstrating her abilities suggests that something happened to damage that conditioning. Sir, Kellerman began, but Morrison cut him off. Let me guess, General. You decided that this quiet little lieutenant was showing insufficient respect for your authority. You concluded that she needed correction, so you took it upon yourself to teach her a lesson about military discipline. The accuracy of Morrison's assessment felt like a physical blow. I was maintaining military standards, sir. Her attitude suggested that she was smarter than you, and that wounded your ego. So you physically assaulted a senior officer conducting classified operations, compromised 18 months of intelligence collection, and triggered a demonstration that has just proven how vulnerable your installation really is. Through his office window, Kellerman could see maintenance crews running between buildings, their normal coordination disrupted by communication failures. Aircraft remained grounded because air traffic control couldn't provide safe guidance. Security patrols moved in confused clusters, unable to coordinate their activities or access the electronic locks that secured sensitive facilities. "What do you need from me?" Kellerman asked, though he suspected that his own needs were about to become irrelevant. "Right now, damage assessment. We need to understand exactly what Commander Reeves has demonstrated, which capabilities she's revealed, and how much of her true mission has been compromised. After that, we'll address the question of your fitness for command and your potential criminal liability for assaulting a federal officer conducting classified operations." Morrison's tone shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike. "In the immediate term, you will take no actions regarding Commander Reeves or her activities. You will not attempt to contact her, arrest her, or interfere with her operations in any way. She is now operating under direct authority from the Secretary of Defense, and any interference with her activities will be treated as obstruction of a national security operation." "Sir, my own personnel are starting to panic. They don't understand what's happening to our systems." "That's exactly the point, General. Your personnel have been operating under the illusion that they understand and control their technology. Commander Reeves is providing them with a comprehensive education about how wrong they've been." As if summoned by Morrison's words, Kellerman's office door opened without warning. No knock, no request for permission. Someone had simply walked into the inner sanctum of base command, as if security protocols no longer applied. The woman who entered was immediately recognizable, despite her brutally shorn hair. Lieutenant Cassandra Reeves moved with the fluid precision that Kellerman now understood indicated capabilities far beyond routine communications maintenance. She carried a tablet computer that displayed real-time status information from systems throughout the base, and her expression showed the kind of calm satisfaction that came from demonstrating mastery over complex systems. "General Kellerman," she said, her voice carrying a note of professional courtesy that somehow managed to sound more threatening than overt hostility. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Behind her, Staff Sergeant Torres entered the office with the expression of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy was wrong. His face showed the peculiar mixture of awe and terror that people developed when they realized they had been working alongside capabilities that could reshape the balance of global power. "Sir," Torres said, his voice tight with stress, "Lieutenant Reeves has just restored partial communications and navigation systems throughout the base. She did it in about 30 seconds using her tablet computer. I thought you should know that the person who received corrective action this morning appears to have capabilities that go significantly beyond routine network maintenance." Kellerman looked at the woman whose hair he had cut, seeing her now not as an insubordinate junior enlisted airman, but as someone whose true authority exceeded his own in ways he was only beginning to understand. The power dynamic had reversed completely, and he was about to discover that there were consequences for assaulting people whose capabilities he couldn't comprehend. The investigation that followed would later be classified at levels so high that even acknowledging its existence required authorization from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But the initial phase unfolded in General Kellerman's office with the methodical precision of a military tribunal. Director Morrison's voice continued to emanate from the secure communication system, providing real-time coordination between the Pentagon and what was rapidly becoming the most significant security review in Whitmore Air Force Base's history. Commander Reeves, please provide a comprehensive status report on Operation Nightfall's current phase. Cassandra activated her tablet, and the device's display appeared simultaneously on every functional screen in Kellerman's office, a demonstration of her complete control over the base's electronic infrastructure that made even the secure communication system seem vulnerable to her influence. Operation Nightfall penetration phase completed as of 1456 hours, she reported with military precision. 18 months of intelligence gathering have documented 247 distinct vulnerabilities in Whitmore's electronic warfare defenses, communication protocols, and navigation systems. All critical systems have been mapped, analyzed, and prepared for either defensive hardening or offensive exploitation as mission requirements dictate. Her fingers moved across the tablet's surface, and new data streams appeared on Kellerman's screens. Demonstration phase initiated at 1347 hours in response to compromise of operational security. Full-spectrum electronic warfare capabilities have been revealed to base personnel through controlled system failures designed to highlight specific vulnerabilities without causing permanent damage or loss of life. General Kellerman watched the data displays with growing comprehension of just how completely he had misunderstood the situation. The network failures that had paralyzed his base weren't random attacks. They were surgical demonstrations, each one designed to expose a particular weakness in Whitmore's defenses. The GPS spoofing that had left his pilots flying blind was reversible. The communication blackouts that had isolated different sections of the base could be corrected instantly. Even the power failures that had forced emergency lighting throughout the facility were precisely controlled to demonstrate vulnerability without creating actual danger. Commander, Morrison's voice carried a note of professional curiosity. Please explain the trigger event that led to revelation of your capabilities. Cassandra's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes as she glanced at Kellerman. At 0600 hours, I was summoned to General Kellerman's office for what was described as routine disciplinary counseling. The general expressed concerns about my military bearing and attitude toward authority. He concluded that corrective action was necessary. She touched her ruined hair with clinical detachment, as if examining evidence from a crime scene. General Kellerman then used military-issue scissors to cut my hair as punishment for perceived insubordination. During this process, he grabbed me physically when I attempted to avoid injury from the scissors. The assault continued for approximately 12 minutes. Staff Sergeant Torres, who had remained standing near the door throughout this exchange, shifted uncomfortably as he began to understand the full scope of what had occurred. He had spent 18 months supervising someone whose security clearance exceeded that of anyone on the base, someone whose mission was so classified that even knowing about it required presidential authorization. Commander Reeves, Morrison said carefully, our psychological assessment protocols indicated that your cover identity conditioning should have been sufficient to maintain operational security even under significant stress. The assault you described, while completely unacceptable, shouldn't have been sufficient to trigger capability revelation. Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, Her voice carried a note of introspection that hadn't been present in her previous responses. Sir, the conditioning was effective for managing normal operational stress, but it was designed around the assumption that I would be dealing with professional military personnel who understood basic concepts of appropriate conduct toward subordinates. She gestured toward Kellerman without looking at him directly. The psychological framework couldn't process the reality of a general officer physically assaulting someone based purely on his perception that they weren't sufficiently deferential. The disconnect between military professionalism and petty authoritarianism created cognitive dissonance that the conditioning couldn't resolve. Morrison's response was immediate and definitive. General Kellerman, you are hereby relieved of command pending investigation. Colonel Thorne will assume temporary command of Whitmore Air Force Base until a replacement can be designated. The words hit Kellerman like artillery fire. 30 years of military service, a career built on discipline and adherence to protocol, ended with a sentence delivered through a secure communication system by someone he had never met. Sir, I request the opportunity to provide my perspective on this incident. Your perspective, General, is that you physically assaulted a senior officer because she didn't show you sufficient deference. That perspective is noted and will be included in the criminal referral that's being prepared by the Judge Advocate General's office. Colonel Rebecca Thorne's voice came through the base communication system, which had apparently been restored by Cassandra's intervention. Command post to General Kellerman. Sir, I have teams standing by to conduct immediate assessment of base systems and coordinate with incoming investigators. Morrison's response came through the secure line. Colonel Thorne, this is Deputy Director Morrison, DIA. You are now the senior officer responsible for Whitmore Air Force Base. Commander Reeves will provide you with a comprehensive briefing on Operation Nightfall and the vulnerabilities that have been identified during her 18-month penetration exercise. Through his office windows, Kellerman could see that normal base operations were resuming. Aircraft were moving on the flight line. Ground crews were coordinating their activities through restored communication channels, and the air traffic control tower was once again tracking incoming and outgoing flights. The electronic infrastructure that had been systematically disabled was functioning normally, as if the past 3 hours had been nothing more than an elaborate training exercise. General Kellerman, Morrison continued, you will remain in your office until military police arrive to escort you to a secure facility where you will be processed for charges including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and obstruction of a classified operation. Your security clearances are hereby suspended, and you are prohibited from discussing any aspect of this incident with anyone not specifically authorized by the Defense Intelligence Agency. Cassandra finally turned to look at Kellerman directly, and he saw in her expression something that might have been pity. Sir, she said quietly, for what it's worth, I understand that you believed you were enforcing military discipline. The problem is that real military discipline requires understanding what you're actually dealing with before you decide how to respond to it. She gestured to her tablet, which continued to display real-time status information from systems throughout the base. You saw a junior enlisted airman who you thought was showing insufficient respect. What you actually encountered was someone whose mission is to identify and exploit exactly the kind of institutional blind spots that your response demonstrated. Staff Sergeant Torres, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally found his voice. Ma'am, if I may ask, what happens now? Do you continue your mission here or? Morrison answered before Cassandra could respond. Operation Nightfall transitions to its next phase. Commander Reeves will work with Colonel Thorne to implement security improvements based on the vulnerabilities she's identified. The demonstration phase has proven that our assumptions about base security were dangerously optimistic. Additionally, Morrison continued, this incident will serve as a case study for senior military leaders throughout the Department of Defense. The lesson is simple. In modern warfare, the most dangerous enemies don't necessarily wear enemy uniforms or carry conventional weapons. Sometimes they're sitting quietly in your own facilities, understanding your systems better than you do, and waiting for someone to make the kind of mistake that reveals just how vulnerable you really are. The sound of approaching vehicles could be heard outside Kellerman's office, military police arriving to begin the process that would end his career and quite possibly his freedom. As he waited for the knock on his door that would signal the beginning of his fall from grace, he found himself staring at the pile of auburn hair on his floor and wondering how such a simple act of perceived discipline had revealed secrets that were never meant to see daylight at Whitmore Air Force Base. The woman whose hair he had cut continued to monitor her tablet, with professional detachment orchestrating the restoration of systems she had temporarily disabled while simultaneously coordinating with authorities who would determine his fate. Real authority, as she had told Staff Sergeant Torres, came from understanding how things actually worked, and she had just demonstrated that understanding in ways that would reshape military security protocols for decades to come. 6 months after the incident that would forever be known in classified circles as the Whitmore Revelation, Commander Cassandra Reeves stood before a joint session of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, in a hearing room so secure that its existence wasn't acknowledged in any public records. The transformation in her appearance was striking. Her hair had grown back to regulation length and was styled with the kind of professional precision that suggested someone who had learned to present herself as both approachable and formidable. But the real transformation was in her role within the Defense Department's evolving understanding of modern warfare. Project Nightfall had expanded from a 12-person experimental program to a full-scale operational division with installations at 47 military bases worldwide. The vulnerabilities that Cassandra had identified at Whitmore had proven to exist in various forms throughout the entire Defense Department's electronic infrastructure. Her demonstration of how easily a single operator could disable critical systems had triggered the most comprehensive security overhaul in military history. "Committee members," she began, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had proven her capabilities in the most dramatic way possible. 6 months ago, I was an unknown lieutenant conducting classified operations at a single Air Force base. Today, I'm briefing you on a program that has fundamentally altered how the United States military approaches electronic warfare and cybersecurity. Senator Patricia Walsh, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward with the expression of someone who had spent months reviewing classified briefings that had challenged everything she thought she knew about national security. "Commander Reeves, your written testimony indicates that the vulnerabilities you identified at Whitmore exist throughout our military infrastructure. Can you explain to this committee exactly how extensive these problems are?" Cassandra activated a tablet that projected classified displays onto screens visible only to committee members with appropriate clearances. "Ma'am, during the past 6 months, my teams have conducted penetration exercises at 47 installations worldwide. In every case, we successfully mapped critical vulnerabilities, identified attack vectors, and demonstrated the ability to disable key systems without detection." The data she displayed was sobering. Air Force bases where GPS spoofing could ground entire squadrons. Navy installations where communication jamming could isolate ships from their command structure. Army facilities where network penetration could compromise operational security for entire theaters of operation. The fundamental problem, Cassandra continued, is that our security protocols were designed to counter conventional threats, foreign intelligence services, terrorist organizations, criminal hackers operating from external networks. They weren't designed to address the possibility that sophisticated adversaries might insert trained operators directly into our facilities. Representative James Morrison, whose namesake had coordinated the initial response to the Whitmore incident, studied the classified displays with evident concern. Commander, are you telling this committee that foreign powers could be conducting the same kind of operations that you demonstrated at Whitmore? Sir, I'm telling you that the techniques I used are well within the capabilities of Chinese, Russian, and Iranian intelligence services. The only difference is that my goal was to identify and correct vulnerabilities, while their goal would be to exploit them during actual conflicts. The implications were staggering. If foreign operators could infiltrate American military installations and position themselves to disable critical systems, then the technological superiority that the United States had relied on for decades could be neutralized before the first shot was fired in any future conflict. What recommendations does your department have for addressing these vulnerabilities? Senator Walsh asked. Cassandra's response outlined a comprehensive transformation of military security protocols that went far beyond traditional approaches to base protection. First, implementation of multi-domain electronic operations training for senior officers at all levels. Military leaders need to understand not just the capabilities of their own systems, but the ways those systems can be compromised by sophisticated adversaries. She pulled up additional displays showing training programs that had already been implemented at select installations. Second, establishment of red team penetration exercises at all critical facilities. We need to constantly test our security assumptions through realistic scenarios that replicate the techniques actual enemies would use. Third, development of human intelligence capabilities specifically focused on identifying insider threats. The most dangerous enemies aren't necessarily the ones who attack from outside. They're the ones who position themselves inside our perimeter and operate undetected for extended periods. Representative Morrison nodded slowly. Commander, your personal experience provides a unique perspective on this issue. Can you tell us about the psychological challenges of conducting long-term covert operations within military facilities? For the first time during her testimony, Cassandra's professional composure showed slight cracks. Sir, maintaining a cover identity within the military requires suppressing every instinct and capability that makes you effective at your real job. For 18 months, I had to pretend to be less intelligent, less capable, and less aware than I actually was. The psychological toll of that performance is significant. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. The incident with General Kellerman wasn't just about inappropriate discipline. It was the culmination of 18 months of being dismissed, underestimated, and treated as insignificant by people whose understanding of modern warfare was decades obsolete. When someone physically assaults you while lecturing you about military discipline, the disconnect between their perception and reality becomes impossible to maintain. Senator Walsh leaned back in her chair, processing the implications of what she was hearing. Commander, what happened to General Kellerman? Ma'am, General Kellerman was court-martialed and convicted of assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and obstruction of classified operations. He was sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 18 months confinement. He's currently serving his sentence at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. The fate of Harrison Kellerman had become a cautionary tale throughout the military officer corps, a general whose career had been destroyed by his inability to recognize that the quiet lieutenant he was attempting to discipline possessed capabilities that exceeded his own understanding of modern warfare. More importantly, Cassandra continued, his replacement, Colonel Rebecca Thorne, has become one of our most effective partners in implementing the security improvements that Operation Nightfall identified. Whitmore Air Force Base is now one of the most secure installations in the Department of Defense, specifically because leadership there understands what they're protecting against. Representative Morrison consulted his classified briefing materials. Commander, your testimony indicates that you're now responsible for training other officers in multi-domain electronic operations. How do you ensure that future operators don't experience the same psychological challenges that led to the Whitmore incident? Sir, we've completely redesigned the psychological conditioning protocols. Instead of requiring operators to suppress their capabilities, we teach them to compartmentalize their knowledge while maintaining their professional identity. The goal is to create people who can blend in while remaining psychologically healthy and operationally effective. She gestured to a section of her briefing materials that outlined the new training programs. Additionally, we've established protocols for senior officers that help them recognize when they might be dealing with personnel who have capabilities beyond their apparent position. The goal is to prevent future incidents like Whitmore by ensuring that military leaders understand the full scope of what they're commanding. Senator Walsh checked her secure tablet, noting that their allocated time was nearly exhausted. Commander Reeves, if you had to summarize the most important lesson from your experience at Whitmore, what would it be? Cassandra considered the question carefully. Ma'am, the most important lesson is that in modern warfare, appearances can be completely deceiving. The most dangerous enemies don't necessarily look dangerous. The most capable allies don't necessarily appear capable. And the most critical vulnerabilities aren't necessarily obvious to people who think they understand their own systems. She stood, gathering her classified materials with the same precision that had characterized her work at Whitmore. The military that wins future conflicts will be the one that best understands the invisible battlefields of electromagnetic warfare, cyber operations, and information dominance. Physical courage and conventional tactics will always be important, but they're no longer sufficient. 6 months ago, a general officer tried to teach me a lesson about military discipline by cutting my hair. What he actually did was demonstrate that our military's understanding of its own vulnerabilities was dangerously incomplete. My job now is to ensure that no future commander makes the same mistake. As the committee session concluded and members began filing out through security checkpoints that scanned for everything from recording devices to biometric anomalies, Cassandra reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning in Kellerman's office. She was no longer the invisible lieutenant whose true capabilities were hidden beneath layers of classification. She was now one of the most senior officers in the Defense Department's newest and most critical operational division, someone whose expertise was sought by military leaders worldwide who were beginning to understand that the next war would be fought in domains they were only beginning to comprehend. The hair that had been brutally shorn as punishment had grown back, but the secrets that had been revealed in the process had fundamentally altered how the American military understood its own vulnerabilities and capabilities. In the end, General Kellerman's attempt to demonstrate his authority had accomplished something far more significant than he could have imagined. It had forced the most powerful military in history to confront truths about modern warfare that it hadn't been prepared to acknowledge, and it had elevated someone whose quiet competence had been dismissed to a position where that competence could reshape the future of national security. The mission continued, but now it operated in the light rather than the shadows, and the person who had once been forced to hide her capabilities was now teaching others to develop the same skills that had once made her invisible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.